It was in Rome, beneath the heavy gaze of cardinals and princes, that a marble vision was unveiled, a woman lying back upon cushions of stone, her form bare, save for a drapery that seemed to slip with defiant ease. The year was 1808, and the sculptor Antonio Canova presented to the world Pauline Bonaparte, sister of Napoleon, transformed into Venus Victrix. Whispers surged like a tide through the halls, for never had a princess of Europe allowed herself to be carved as a goddess of love, not in the half-shadows of allegory, but with a sensuality too plain, too daring. In that single moment, marble was no longer cold, but scandal itself became flesh in stone. Before we drift into the long weave of Pauline's life, I greet you, dear listener. Tell me, where are you listening, and at what hour of the night or day? Write it in the comments, for these stories stretch across the earth like a chain of memory. And if you have not yet joined, press the subscribe button, that the echo of this channel may continue to carry the voices of the past into your quiet rooms. Now let us begin. The island of Corsica, where Pauline Bonaparte first drew breath, was no polished jewel of empire but a rugged land, half forgotten by Paris and forever wrestling with its own storms. The sea pressed hard against its cliffs, and the olive groves bent under winds that smelled of salt and wild herbs. In Ajaccio, among narrow lanes where shutters clattered in sudden gusts, the Bonaparte household lived neither in great wealth nor in deep poverty, but in that precarious middle ground where pride holds more weight than coin. It was in this world that Pauline, the sixth child of Letizia and Carlo Bonaparte, was born in October of 1780. She was a small child, fragile in body, but with eyes that even then seemed to carry a certain glimmer, as if promising a future that the island itself could not contain. The Bonapartes were many in number, children running through corridors, voices filling their modest house. There was Napoleon, the second son, whose sharp mind and silent intensity set him apart even as a boy. There was Joseph, the elder, mild and accommodating, and later there would be Caroline, fierce in her own right. Pauline grew in this chorus, not the center of it, yet not hidden either, for her beauty, even in youth, had a way of drawing glances. She moved lightly with that same grace she would carry into courts and salons, though then it was only in the courtyards of Ajaccio, where dust rose around her ankles and laughter chased the long evenings into night. The air of Corsica was thick with memory and rebellion. Only a decade before her birth, the island had been wrested from Genoa by the French, and the great patriot Pasquale Paoli had struggled to keep independence alive. In the Bonaparte household, pride in Corsican identity mingled with the desire to rise in French society, a duality that left its mark on each child. Perhaps Pauline felt it least, for beauty often transcends such questions of nation and belonging. Yet the pride, the sense of being set apart, was in her blood. She was Letizia's daughter, and Letizia was known across Ajaccio as a woman of stern endurance, a mother who bore her children as though she were bearing soldiers for the cause of destiny. Pauline's father, Carlo, was already waning in strength by the time she was a child. He had ambitions, yes, but his health faltered and debt pressed against him. The children watched as their mother held the family together with a hardness that seemed carved of the same stone as Corsican cliffs. Pauline would later carry none of that severity in her manner. Instead, she inherited perhaps the opposite, an instinct to soften, to charm, to disarm. But even such softness was shaped in contrast to Letizia's iron. When I imagine Pauline as a girl, I hear the rustle of olive leaves in the afternoon, the clatter of market stalls where she and her sisters might pass, their heads turning at every sound. I smell the mingled smoke of hearth fires rising from homes, clinging to hillsides. I see the sea, always the sea, its vastness a reminder that the world stretched far beyond this rocky isle, though perhaps only Napoleon, already dreaming of empire, truly felt its pull. Pauline, I think, absorbed the sea differently, not as a call to conquest, but as a backdrop, a rhythm, a presence that would stay with her long after she left. Her beauty was remarked upon early. Neighbors whispered that her features, delicate and perfectly balanced, seemed destined to draw eyes, while her skin carried that softness rare in the island's sun. Some say she had already learned as a child how to wield beauty as a shield and as a weapon, though one wonders how much of that is hindsight, a story written backward from the scandalous woman she became. What can be certain is that she was noticed even then, and perhaps that noticing gave her a different awareness of herself, an early lesson in the power she could hold without lifting a finger. The Bonaparte household did not know stability. Debts forced moves, wars unsettled the region, and the father's declining health meant uncertainty always lingered. It was not a household where a child could feel secure in possessions or in the steady rhythm of days. Pauline grew up amid change, and in that change, she learned to live in the present moment, to take what could be taken before it was lost. This instinct for immediacy, for seizing pleasure before it faded, would mark her life as much as her beauty. Sometimes I wonder whether, in those early years, she sensed already the gravity of her brother Napoleon, the one who would shape her destiny as much as she shaped his legend. He was quiet, stern, given to sudden flashes of ambition that startled even his family. To Pauline, he was both brother and something more, a figure around whom the air itself seemed to thicken. Did she, as a child, sit beside him in silence, wondering why he spoke so little, why he stared at the horizon as if listening to voices she could not hear? Or did she simply dance around him, her laughter a foil to his intensity? Memory does not tell us, and so we are left to imagine. And yet, amid this island life of windswept hills and proud families, Pauline was still only a girl, not yet Venus, not yet scandal. She played, she teased, she learned the steps of Corsican dances, her skirts brushing the earth. She listened to tales told by elders of vendettas and ancient honor. She may have lifted her eyes to the stars above the Mediterranean, wondering what awaited beyond. In that quiet wonder, she was like any child, untouched for the moment by the histories she would one day inhabit. Still, the island was no permanent home for destiny. The Bonapartes would leave, drawn by necessity, by revolution, by the hunger of ambition. Pauline would be carried with them, first into hardship, then into the glittering salons of France, and finally into the marble immortality of scandal. But here, in Corsica, her story begins with the sound of waves beating endlessly against cliffs, a rhythm as old as time, unresolved and eternal. The candle sputters in the damp night of Marseille, its flame bending and then steadying, as if reluctant to hold its place in the world. It is here that Pauline, still young, still unformed by scandal or marble, found herself with her family after they left Corsica behind. The Bonapartes had abandoned their island at a time of turmoil, when loyalties shifted and enemies multiplied. In Marseille, they were exiles, and the proud family that once carried themselves with Corsican dignity now felt the bite of hunger and the gaze of strangers who measured them by their poverty. The narrow streets smelled of salt and tar, the harbor was filled with masts creaking in the wind, and the air seemed always damp, always restless, like a place where permanence could never take root. For Pauline, the transition from the olive groves of Ajaccio to the crowded quarters of Marseille must have been bewildering. She was not yet 15, and though she was already noticed for her striking face and graceful movements, she was also one among many siblings who needed food, clothing, and a place to sleep. Her mother, Letizia, whose severity had already shaped the household, carried herself like a matriarch of legend, insisting on dignity in the face of hardship. Yet beneath that iron presence was the reality of hunger. Meals were sparse, shoes were worn thin, and the daughters of the house could not be adorned as daughters of nobility. They were seen instead as little more than Corsican girls, foreign in speech and manner. It is in these years that Pauline's allure sharpened, not in jewels or finery, but in the raw contrast between scarcity and beauty. There is something almost cruel in how poverty can magnify the presence of a beautiful girl, for it sets her apart, makes her radiance more startling against the shadows of want. In the markets of Marseille, where fishmongers shouted and women bargained loudly, one imagines her passing, and the eyes that followed her not because she was dressed richly, she was not, but because something in her carriage, in the tilt of her head, betrayed a natural magnetism. Even now, before the scandals, before the sculptors, she was learning the silent exchange of glances, the power of presence. But these years were not only about beauty, they were about survival. Napoleon, still young himself, wrote letters of ambition and desperation, trying to secure positions and favor, already sensing that France was a land in upheaval, where fortunes could be made as quickly as they could be lost. Joseph, the eldest, tried to keep stability. The younger children, including Pauline, lived in the constant uncertainty of whether tomorrow would bring food or disappointment. Their father had already died, leaving the family under the iron hand of Letizia and the growing ambition of Napoleon. The flame of the Bonapartes burned dim in Marseille, but it did not go out. For Pauline, adolescence passed in the shadows of revolution. The France of her girlhood was not the courtly France of silks and powdered wigs, but a France where heads fell beneath the guillotine, where whispers of loyalty or betrayal could mean life or death. Did she, in those years, sense that her destiny would be tied not to the terror, but to what came after, to the empire her brother would carve from the ruins of monarchy? Or was she simply a girl, noticing the way her hair fell when she leaned over a basin, or laughing with her sisters despite the cold drafts that ran through their rooms? In exile and want, one learns resilience or defiance. Pauline seemed to choose defiance, though softly, with the curve of a smile, with the way she carried herself as if she were already above her station. There are stories that she was vain even in youth, that she loved to adorn herself, to polish her natural gifts, though in Marseille the adornments could only have been meager, perhaps a ribbon, perhaps a borrowed trinket. And yet, in memory, those who saw her remembered her less for what she wore than for the way she seemed to wear the very air around her, bending it into an aura of grace. But hunger and pride are not easily reconciled. There must have been nights when Letizia's stern voice reminded her daughters that beauty was no shield against hardship, that survival required discipline. Pauline, however, was never a creature of discipline. She was a creature of instinct, of desire, of the moment. It is here, perhaps, that the first traces of her later life can be glimpsed, the refusal to live by the constraints of poverty, the refusal to be diminished by circumstance. She would not be defined by want. She would become, instead, a figure who devoured life, who reached for pleasure as if it were her birthright, even when the world denied her so much. The Marseille years were also a testing ground for the Bonaparte bonds. The siblings were many, and though they quarreled and competed, their shared exile deepened their ties. Pauline's connection to Napoleon began here, to take shape, not only as a bond of family, but as something more intricate, woven of dependence, admiration, and the strange magnetism of his will. She was not yet the loyal sister who would follow him even into his fall, but the roots of that loyalty were growing in these narrow streets, where all they had was each other. At times, I imagine Pauline standing at the harbor, watching ships from distant places, their sails like ghosts against the horizon. The air would have been heavy with the smell of fish and tar, the cries of gulls cutting through the murmur of sailors. Did she, watching those ships, dream of escape, of grandeur, of rooms filled with music and perfume instead of damp straw? Did she know already that her life would not remain confined to these narrow streets, that her beauty was a passport even when coin was lacking? Or did she simply watch, idle, letting the salt wind lift her hair, thinking of nothing at all? As years passed, Marseille gave way to the larger currents of French destiny. The revolution devoured its enemies, and then, slowly, the Bonaparte star began to rise. Napoleon's victories in Italy opened doors, and the family, once seen as exiles, began to walk in brighter halls. Pauline was carried with them, no longer a hungry girl in damp rooms, but a young woman entering society where glances no longer whispered pity, but admiration, envy, and desire. The candle that once sputtered now burned with a steadier flame, yet the memory of those years never left her. The hunger, the damp walls, the sense of being out of place. These were ghosts that followed her into palaces. Perhaps this is why she clung so fiercely to pleasure, to adornment, to love affairs that scandalized and amused. Perhaps it was her way of defying the memory of want, of ensuring that no one could look at her again and see poverty. If so, then Marseille was not merely a passage, but a wound that shaped the rest of her life. The night in Marseille grows quiet now. The candle burns lower, its flame tracing shadows on the uneven walls. Outside, the sound of waves against the harbor stones lingers, a rhythm without end. And from this dim room of exile and hunger, Pauline will soon step into the wider stage, where her beauty will become both her fortune and her burden. The murmured voices behind closed doors linger like echoes of an old house, words half heard through shutters, promises and warnings folded together. From Marseille's dim rooms, Pauline Bonaparte stepped into a new season of her life, one marked not only by survival but by the strange light cast by her brother's ascent. Napoleon, once the silent and austere son of Corsica, began to rise through the ranks of the French army, and with his victories in Italy, the Bonaparte name traveled beyond narrow streets and entered the salons of Paris. The family, once clothed in patched garments and bowed by exile, found themselves lifted, carried as though on a current of fortune that none of them could have summoned alone. For Pauline, the change was profound, and yet it revealed more of her nature than it concealed. In Paris, she was no longer a girl glanced at in markets or whispered about by neighbors. She was a young woman, entering rooms where chandeliers shimmered, where voices carried both admiration and malice. Her beauty, already remarked upon in Marseille, now found its stage. Courtiers, generals, men of influence, many paused when she entered, their conversations stilled, their gazes pulled toward her. She was still unpolished, Corsican in manner, her accent thick, her behavior sometimes impulsive. But beauty has its own refinement, and Pauline's presence softened her rough edges. She could laugh too loudly, yet the laughter seemed like music. She could stumble in etiquette, but the fall only drew more eyes. It was as though the world conspired to excuse her faults, for beauty, when rare enough, is forgiven almost anything. The Bonaparte sisters were often compared to one another. Caroline was clever, ambitious, sharp, a woman who thought in terms of advantage. Elisa was composed, stately, capable of governance. Pauline was different. She did not seek power in the same way, nor did she measure her worth by political schemes. She was instinctive, a creature of presence rather than strategy. And yet her very lack of calculation became a kind of power. Men admired her not for what she might gain, but for the sensation of being near her. She seemed to live as though life were not a chessboard of moves, but a feast laid out for indulgence. It was in this atmosphere that she began to attract not only suitors, but whispers. The revolution had left society raw, half broken and half reborn, and in this liminal space, Pauline's beauty stood as both promise and provocation. She danced, she flirted, she lingered in glances too long for propriety. Yet she was still Napoleon's sister, and that shadow, both protective and dangerous, hung over her. For those who admired her, it was impossible to separate desire from caution. for her name was now tied to a man whose star was rising too quickly to ignore. The murmurs in the salons grew not only about her charm, but about her brother's growing authority. It was whispered that Napoleon's victories were more than mere battles. They were steps toward a reshaping of France. Pauline, sitting in candlelit rooms, surely felt the weight of those murmurs, though whether she understood their scope is uncertain. Perhaps she did not care, for politics did not ignite her spirit. What mattered to her was the present moment, the attention given, the sensation of being admired. And yet being Napoleon's sister meant that she would never live only for herself. Her beauty and her choices would always reflect upon him, and so her life, even in its most intimate indulgences, was tethered to the great currents of history. There were early rumors of suitors of rank and fortune, men who sought her hand not only for her beauty, but for the connection to her rising brother. Yet Pauline's instinct was not to be easily bound. She hesitated, she deflected, she allowed herself to be courted without being captured. It was not that she refused marriage, her time would come, but that she seemed to sense the freedom of youth as a flame too bright to extinguish too soon. And so, she moved among admirers, sometimes reckless, sometimes cautious, always leaving a trail of murmured speculation. One cannot help but imagine those Parisian evenings, the gilded mirrors, the scent of wax and perfume, the distant sound of carriage wheels clattering outside, Pauline seated in a circle of women, her laughter rising like a spark, her hand gloved and pale against the darkness of silk. Men drawing closer, caught in her orbit, whispering to one another later behind closed doors of her daring glances, her careless grace. It was here that her legend began to take shape, not as a dutiful sister or a prudent young woman, but as something freer, more dangerous. And yet, beneath the shimmer, there was still the girl from Corsica, the one who had known hunger in Marseille, who had walked past harbor ships and dreamed of elsewhere. Did she feel at times that she was living a borrowed life, that the luxury was a thin veil over the memory of damp rooms and scarce bread? Or had she cast those memories aside completely, choosing instead to believe that she was always meant for chandeliers and admirers? History leaves no clear answer. What is certain is that Pauline never looked back for long. She lived forward, into sensation, into indulgence, into the unmeasured present. Her bond with Napoleon deepened in these years. He was not a brother easy to approach, stern, reserved, commanding. But Pauline, perhaps uniquely among his siblings, had a power over him. Her beauty softened him, her charm amused him. Her loyalty, though sometimes wavering in the details of life, was deep in its essence. Others might fear him, but Pauline could tease him, disarm him, remind him of their shared roots. And in return, Napoleon protected her, excused her, tolerated scandals that would have crushed another woman. This closeness, already remarked upon by observers, would later grow into the most whispered rumor of all. But for now, it was simply a bond between siblings who had shared exile and were now sharing ascent. Still, those voices behind closed doors never ceased. They grew louder as Pauline's allure spread, as her choices invited speculation, as her freedom unsettled those who lived by rules. To some, she was enchanting. To others, she was already scandalous. But what all agreed upon was that she could not be ignored. And so the door to the next stage of her life began to open, not with quiet or subtlety, but with the rustle of uniforms, the call of orders, the crossing of seas. For Pauline was about to leave not only the salons of Paris, but Europe itself, carried on her brother's ambitions and her husband's command into lands far from chandeliers, where beauty could not shield her from sickness, nor charm from loss. Behind those murmured voices, the air grows heavier, the words fade, and what remains is the distant rustle of funeral drapery, waiting, as Pauline follows her first husband to Saint-Domingue, a place where her laughter would be silenced by fever and her beauty shadowed by grief. The rustle of funeral drapery lingers in the air, heavy and suffocating, a reminder that even in youth, even in beauty, one cannot escape the shadow of death. Pauline Bonaparte, scarcely out of her teens, found herself stepping into a chapter of life bound not by glittering salons, but by the solemnity of marriage and the weight of distant lands. Her brother Napoleon, intent upon securing alliances and shaping the destinies of his sisters as though they were pieces on a chessboard, arranged her union with General Charles Leclerc. Leclerc was competent, loyal, not without ambition, but he was not a man whose presence stirred Pauline's heart. Yet for a Bonaparte, love was seldom the true currency of union. Marriages were bonds of strategy, threads in the larger tapestry of power. The wedding itself, modest in its ceremony yet grand in its implications, was received by society as both fitting and advantageous. Pauline, dressed in garments that could not conceal her natural allure, stood beside a man who seemed almost overshadowed by her radiance. Observers noted that her beauty gleamed too brightly for a figure such as Leclerc, who, though a general, lacked the charisma that clung to her like perfume. And yet, with vows exchanged, her path was bound to his, leading her not into salons but across the ocean, into the fever-ridden air of Saint-Domingue. The island awaited them with a beauty as intoxicating as it was dangerous. Lush hills rose against the sky, palms swayed under relentless sun, and the air was thick with scents unknown in Europe: frangipani, sugarcane, damp earth after sudden rains. But beneath this beauty there lay unrest. The French colony, rich in sugar and coffee, was in upheaval, its enslaved population in rebellion under leaders who refused to return to chains. Leclerc had been charged by Napoleon with the task of suppressing this revolt, of restoring French control. Pauline was swept into this mission not as soldier nor strategist, but as a young wife, carrying with her the trappings of elegance into a land where life itself was fragile. The contrast was jarring. In Paris, she had been surrounded by mirrors and candlelight, her reflection forever caught in admiration. In Saint-Domingue, her mirrors reflected a face damp with tropical heat, her skin touched not by admiration, but by swarms of insects, her ears filled not with music, but with the drone of fevered nights. She wrote letters that revealed her despair, her longing for Europe, her distaste for the harsh realities of colonial life. She did not hide her unhappiness. Perhaps she could not, for Pauline was not one to veil her emotions beneath stoic silence. She complained of the climate, the discomfort, the endless fear of sickness. And indeed, sickness was everywhere. Yellow fever stalked the colony like a silent predator, claiming soldiers by the hundreds, sparing neither rank nor station. In the midst of this, Pauline remained herself, still adorned, still intent on surrounding her discomfort with touches of luxury. She carried with her fine gowns, perfumes, and jewels, as if to defy the jungle pressing in upon her. Servants attended her, and in her quarters there was always a trace of Europe, a stubborn insistence that beauty and refinement could hold back the chaos outside, yet the reality of Saint-Domingue seeped in nonetheless. The nights were filled with distant drums, the murmurs of rebellion, the cries of the sick, and Pauline, though sheltered, could not remain untouched. Her marriage to Leclerc, already strained by her restless nature, weakened further under the island's oppressive weight. She was young, still instinctively drawn to pleasure, and rumors arose even here, whispers of infidelities, of her charm turning toward others, while her husband battled both rebels and fever. Whether true or exaggerated, the whispers reveal how inseparable her image had become from scandal. Even in the tropics, even surrounded by death, Pauline's allure and recklessness did not fade, but death drew closer still. In 1802, Charles Leclerc succumbed to yellow fever, one among countless victims. The drapery of mourning fell upon Pauline once more, this time not in rumor or foreshadow but in grim reality. She was left a widow at 22, stranded on a fevered island, her beauty now clothed in black, her jewels hidden beneath the veil of grief. Yet her grief was ambiguous. Did she truly mourn Leclerc, whose presence had never lit her spirit, or did she mourn instead the collapse of the fragile security that marriage had provided? Her letters suggest both weariness and resignation, as though widowhood, though tragic, also freed her. The return to Europe was heavy with death. Ships bore back not only Pauline, but coffins, memories of soldiers lost, and the bitter failure of Napoleon's designs for Saint-Domingue. The tropical air, once intoxicating, left only a residue of despair upon her skin. Yet as she stepped once more upon European soil, Pauline was transformed, not merely by grief, but by the strange glamour that clings to youth, touched by tragedy. She was a widow, and widowhood carried with it a certain allure in society. A woman unbound, touched by sorrow, yet free again to choose. Pauline embraced this role as though it had been waiting for her. She returned not as the girl who had left, nor as the innocent bride of a general, but as a woman who had faced death's shadow, who had worn mourning garments and walked among coffins, and yet still radiated beauty. This contrast heightened her legend. Admirers saw in her not only loveliness, but resilience, the image of Venus herself touched by sorrow yet undiminished. If scandal had already clung to her, widowhood deepened the mystery. She was no longer simply Napoleon's sister or Leclerc's wife. She was Pauline, widow of Saint-Domingue, a figure who carried both allure and tragedy in her very presence. And so, the funeral drapery lingers in memory, but Pauline does not remain shrouded for long. Black garments gave way once more to silks, the silence of mourning replaced again by laughter, by glances across candle-lit rooms. The return to Europe was both an end and a beginning. For Pauline, widowhood would not be a prison. It would be a doorway into a second life, one where her defiance of convention would blaze brighter still. The drapery falls silent now, folded into memory. In its place, a new sound rises, the clink of a wine glass, half filled, raised in the company of admirers who watch her not with pity but with desire, as Pauline steps once more into the salons of Europe, widowhood transfigured into a new kind of freedom. The clink of a wine glass, half filled, echoes faintly, as though suspended in the air of a Parisian salon. It is here that Pauline Bonaparte, returned from the fevered despair of Saint-Domingue, steps once more into the gaze of society. She is draped in black, the widow of General Leclerc, yet widowhood only heightens her allure. Where once she had been a girl uncertain of her station, she now carries herself with the aura of experience, as though death had touched her, but not consumed her. To men and women alike she appeared as a paradox, sorrow and seduction folded into one form, a figure who could not be ignored. In Paris, news of her return spread quickly. She had gone to the tropics as a bride, scarcely known outside the shadow of her brother. She came back a widow, spoken of in hushed tones, the survivor of fever and revolt. The tragedy that clung to her only made her beauty more arresting, for beauty touched by sorrow gains a depth that pure innocence cannot. In gatherings, her dark gowns contrasted with the glow of her skin, her laughter carrying the weight of both memory and defiance. The glass half filled in her hand seemed always symbolic, half mourning, half anticipation of life's pleasures still to come. Society's eyes were merciless in their scrutiny, yet they softened when turned upon her. She moved with a grace that made her every gesture appear deliberate, though perhaps it was instinct rather than intention. Widows were expected to carry themselves with restraint, to embody modest sorrow, yet Pauline unsettled such expectations. She did not retreat into shadows. She did not veil her beauty beyond recognition. Instead, she allowed it to shine even through the fabric of mourning, as though to say that death had touched her, but had not claimed her essence. It was both shocking and irresistible. Whispers of lovers soon returned to her orbit. Some claimed she had already begun to indulge in affairs even during her widowhood, that her need for attention was too strong to be confined by convention. Others defended her, saying that beauty such as hers was always a magnet for gossip, that perhaps she had done little more than smile too openly or linger too long in conversation. Whatever the truth, the rumors wove themselves into her image. Pauline was not only a widow, she was a widow who carried desire in her wake, a woman who blurred the lines between grief and indulgence. Her brother Napoleon watched with his usual sternness. For all his ambition and severity, he had a tenderness for Pauline, one that puzzled observers. He tolerated in her what he might not in others. Though her scandals troubled him, he did not sever his affection. Instead, he seemed to excuse her, as though her beauty gave her a license that others could not claim. To some, this indulgence hinted at a closeness too intimate, a bond that went beyond sibling affection. To others, it was simply the mark of a brother who, for all his iron will, could not resist the disarming charm of his sister. The truth, as always, lay hidden in ambiguity, feeding the whispers of salons. Pauline herself seemed unbothered by such rumors. She lived as though the present moment were all that mattered, as though whispers evaporated like smoke once laughter filled the room again. Her laughter in those years was described as both light and unsettling. Light because it seemed to brush away sorrow. Unsettling because it reminded listeners that this woman was not bound by the same rules as others. She had faced death. She had returned, and now she demanded to live not cautiously but recklessly, as though each day were a gift to be consumed. The salons of Paris were alive with her presence. Chandeliers spilled light across mirrors, voices mingled with the strains of violins, and always there was Pauline, her figure traced by candlelight, her gaze resting on whomever caught her attention. Admirers leaned close, intoxicated not only by her beauty but by the sense that she existed beyond their grasp, never fully theirs, always a step removed. She gave herself to the moment but withheld permanence, a balance that kept desire burning but never satisfied. And yet, for all her indulgence, she was not immune to loneliness. Widowhood, though gilded by allure, left her untethered. She had no husband to anchor her, no clear role beyond being Napoleon's sister. The admiration of salons was fleeting. The whispers, though constant, did not provide stability. Beneath the laughter, perhaps there was an emptiness, a need for a bond more lasting than the glances of admirers. Or perhaps not. Perhaps Pauline truly lived without regret, embracing the fleeting nature of each encounter. History does not tell us what she felt in the silence after gatherings, when the lights dimmed and only the sound of her own breath filled the chamber. It was in this state of half mourning, half indulgence that she soon entered into another union, one that would bind her to a family older and more venerable than her own. The Borghese, an Italian house steeped in history and wealth, would claim her as daughter-in-law, and through them, Pauline would become not only a widow remembered, but a princess, scandalous. Yet the path to that union was not immediate. For a time, she remained suspended between worlds, her glass always half filled, her life always half in shadow, half in light. When I think of her in these years, I imagine the quiet after a ball, when the carriages have rolled away and the wax has melted low. Pauline seated before a mirror, removing her jewels one by one, her face still luminous even in fatigue, the black garments of widowhood set aside, replaced with silks once more, her reflection neither wholly sorrowful nor wholly joyous. A woman poised between past and future, mourning and desire, shadow and flame, and so the clink of the half-filled glass lingers, unresolved. The liquid within it trembles, neither drained nor abandoned, a symbol of a life that refused to be confined to one meaning. Soon that glass will be carried with her into marble halls, where footsteps echo against ancient stone, and Pauline will step not only into the arms of admirers, but into the storied halls of Roman nobility, her scandal now dressed in titles and sculpted in stone. The echo of footsteps through marble halls carries us now into the world of Rome, where Pauline Bonaparte, no longer merely a widow of Saint-Domingue, became Princess Borghese. Her marriage to Prince Camillo Borghese in 1803 was not a love story born of passion, but a union woven from politics and advantage, arranged in part by her brother Napoleon, who saw in it both prestige and stability for his sister. The Borghese family was one of the oldest and most venerable of Roman nobility, their lineage stretching back centuries, their palaces filled with relics, their name bound to traditions that seemed immovable. To join them was to step into a world of ancient order, of solemn dignity, of marble silence that contrasted deeply with Pauline's restless spirit. The marriage ceremony was grand in appearance, yet beneath its surface, unease lingered. Pauline, draped in finery, was dazzling to behold, her beauty a spectacle that drew every eye. Camillo, solemn and restrained, stood beside her with the posture of duty rather than ardor. The Borghese family received her with courtesy, yet whispers passed even on that day, for Pauline's reputation had already crossed borders. They knew of her allure, her rumored lovers, her refusal to be tamed by widowhood. To them, she was both a prize and a risk. She brought with her the name of Bonaparte, powerful and rising, yet also the shadow of scandal. Life in the Borghese palaces was a far cry from the glitter of Parisian salons. Rome was ancient, steeped in rituals and hierarchies that left little space for Pauline's instinctive freedom. Marble halls stretched cold and unyielding, frescoed ceilings looked down with solemnity, and servants moved in quiet precision. For Pauline, who thrived on warmth, laughter, and indulgence, such grandeur must have felt at times like a cage, beautiful but confining. The echo of her footsteps down those corridors could never be filled with the same music as a Parisian ball. Her relationship with Camillo soon reflected this dissonance. He was dutiful, serious, a man who embodied restraint. She was reckless, sensuous, incapable of burying her impulses beneath duty. Their temperaments collided rather than merged. Though she bore the title of princess, Pauline wore it lightly, almost mockingly at times, as though daring the Borghese to confront her. She flouted conventions, ignored whispers, and pursued pleasure, even when it meant shaming her new family. It is said she often left Rome for Paris, unable to tolerate the stiffness of her husband's household, preferring instead the vibrant chaos of her brother's empire and the admiration of Parisian society. Yet Rome did not vanish from her life. Within its walls, she became immortalized in one of the most daring acts of her defiance, her decision to pose for Antonio Canova, the sculptor of gods. Canova, celebrated throughout Europe for his neoclassical genius, was commissioned to sculpt Pauline. Instead of being portrayed as a noblewoman clothed in dignity, Pauline chose to appear as Venus Victrix, the goddess of love triumphant. Reclining on marble cushions, one hand holding the apple of victory, she allowed herself to be rendered nearly nude, her form draped only in a thin cloth that revealed more than it concealed. This choice scandalized her husband's family and much of Roman society. For a princess to permit such a portrayal was unthinkable, an affront to propriety and tradition. Yet Pauline seemed to delight in the outrage. When asked whether she had truly posed nude for Canova, she is said to have replied with serene mischief, "Why not? The studio was heated." Whether the story is truth or myth, it captures her essence. Careless of convention, fearless in scandal, certain that her beauty was a power to be displayed rather than hidden, The statue remains one of Canova's masterpieces, a vision of sensuality frozen in stone. In it, Pauline's beauty transcends mortality, captured forever as a goddess rather than as a princess. Yet in its very immortality lies the audacity of her choice, for she blurred the line between flesh and marble, between woman and legend. The Borghese family, despite their disapproval, eventually housed the statue in their gallery, where it remains, a silent testament to Pauline's refusal to be bound by their traditions. Her life with Camillo did not deepen with time. They grew estranged, their union more a matter of name than of companionship. Pauline drifted increasingly back toward Paris, where she was surrounded by the familiar intoxication of admirers and the indulgence of imperial society. Rome, with its marble solemnity, receded into the background, a stage she visited but never embraced. Yet even in distance, her Borghese title clung to her, adding to her aura of paradox, a Bonaparte by birth, a Borghese by marriage, a goddess by sculpture, and a scandal by choice. And so the footsteps echo still through those marble halls, footsteps that carried her not into compliance, but into defiance, not into restraint, but into indulgence. Pauline transformed the halls of ancient nobility into a backdrop for her own legend, unsettling, dazzling, and provoking in equal measure. The marble grows colder as the halls fall silent. In that silence, another presence gathers, the lingering chill of stone, the cool touch of Canova's Venus, waiting to guide us into the next stage of her tale, where Pauline's beauty and audacity would be carved forever in scandalous immortality. The lingering chill of stone guides us now into the quiet of a Roman studio, where Antonio Canova, master of marble, prepared to immortalize Pauline Bonaparte. The Borghese palaces, with their solemn echoes, had not subdued her spirit, and in choosing to be sculpted, Pauline would once more assert herself not as the dutiful wife of Camillo Borghese, but as a woman who belonged to legend. The air of the studio was cool and dusted with fine white powder. Blocks of Carrara marble loomed in their rawness, waiting for form. And among these stones, Pauline entered, carrying with her not only her beauty, but the audacity to be seen as Venus, the goddess of love herself. To choose such a pose was no small act. Roman nobility measured its women by restraint, by modesty, by silence. For a princess to allow herself to be sculpted reclining, half-nude, her form bared to eternity, was to invite scandal that could never be undone. Yet Pauline seemed to revel in it. She was not one to hide behind convention, nor to fear whispers. Beauty, she believed, was meant to be displayed, to be celebrated, even if it meant defying every expectation. And in this belief, she and Canova found a meeting point. He, the sculptor of gods, and she, a woman who insisted on living as if she herself were divine. The statue that emerged is among the most haunting of Canova's works. Pauline reclines on a carved couch, her body draped in a fabric so thin that it reveals rather than conceals. One arm supports her, the other holds the golden apple of Venus, the prize of beauty itself. Her head turns with a calm, knowing grace, as if indifferent to the gaze she commands. The stone, cold and unyielding, becomes flesh in Canova's hands, each curve and fold rendered with startling delicacy. To stand before it is to feel both the distance of myth and the intimacy of presence, as though Venus herself had chosen to appear not in Olympus but in Rome. The scandal was immediate. Rome whispered. Paris whispered louder. How could a princess of the Borghese allow herself to be depicted in such a way? Did she truly pose nude before the sculptor, or did Canova work from imagination? The question lingered like perfume in salons, never resolved, always feeding curiosity. When asked, Pauline is said to have answered with playful indifference, her words sharp with mischief. But of course, the studio was warm. Whether she spoke those words, or whether they were invented by gossip, they captured her essence perfectly. A woman who disarmed judgment with wit, who made scandal itself appear like art. Camillo Borghese, her husband, was humiliated. The Borghese family, so steeped in solemn dignity, was aghast. And yet the statue remained. It could not be destroyed, for it was Canova's masterpiece. Nor could it be denied, for Pauline's beauty, once carved in stone, belonged not only to her, but to history. The Borghese displayed it discreetly, allowing few to see, yet its fame grew nonetheless. Visitors who glimpsed it carried the memory with them, and even those who never saw it spoke of it as though they had. In becoming Venus, Pauline blurred the line between woman and myth. She was no longer merely Napoleon's sister, nor merely Camillo's wife. She became an icon of sensuality, a symbol of audacity. Her body, preserved in marble, was elevated beyond mortality, yet also fixed forever in scandal. Did she understand, as she reclined for Canova, that she was securing her immortality? Did she sense that long after her laughter faded, long after her scandals were forgotten, her image would still command silence in galleries? Perhaps she did. Perhaps that was why she chose Venus, why she chose to embrace the role of goddess, for Pauline seemed always to live as though she belonged not to ordinary time, but to legend. And yet the statue also carried a shadow, for in its cold perfection lies a reminder of mortality. Pauline, vibrant and reckless, was frozen here in eternal youth, untouched by the illnesses that would later weaken her, untouched by the passage of years. The chill of stone, so different from the warmth of her presence, holds both her triumph and her ghost. To look upon it is to feel the paradox of Pauline herself, alive in beauty, dead in permanence, both present and absent. Society did not forget. The whispers multiplied. Some admired her courage, others condemned her shamelessness. But Pauline did not retreat. She continued to live as she chose, surrounding herself with admirers, indulging in pleasures, mocking the severity of her husband's world. Canova's Venus became not only her image, but her emblem, proof that she would not be confined by convention. And so, even as the Borghese palaces remained heavy with disapproval, Pauline carried with her the lightness of defiance, as though scandal itself were simply another jewel to adorn her. The coolness of the marble lingers, pressing into the imagination like a chill against the skin. It is the touch of eternity, unchanging, indifferent to the warmth of life. And as that chill deepens, another presence begins to stir. The faint scent of perfume in a midnight chamber, the whisper of lovers behind closed doors, the reckless indulgence of a woman who refused to live by any rule but her own. The faint scent of perfume in a midnight chamber lingers in the imagination, sweet yet heavy, the fragrance of secrecy and indulgence. It is into such chambers that Pauline Bonaparte carried herself time and again, never content to be bound by the rigid confines of Roman nobility, nor by the solemn weight of her husband's presence. Where Camillo Borghese sought order and propriety, Pauline sought sensation and adoration. Lovers gathered around her like moths to flame, drawn not only by her legendary beauty, but by the promise of her defiance, her refusal to yield to convention. In salons and boudoirs alike, she became the subject of endless whispers. Who had entered her rooms, who had lingered too long, who had been dismissed with a smile or a sigh. Her affairs were not discreet, or rather, they were discreet enough to escape official scandal, but open enough to feed rumor. Pauline seemed to take pleasure in this balance, allowing just enough to be seen, to be suggested, to keep her name on every tongue. The list of her admirers grew long, generals and nobles, artists and courtiers. Some claimed she sought passion in every embrace, others that she pursued only diversion, a way to stave off the boredom of a marriage that left her cold. Whatever the truth, Her lovers became part of her legend, woven into the fabric of her identity as inseparably as her beauty or her statue. There was something haunting in this endless pursuit of affection. Pauline, adored by nearly all who saw her, never seemed satisfied. Admiration in public was not enough. She sought the intimacy of private devotion, the heat of desire that confirmed her power. Yet such passion is fleeting, and once the moment passed, she often moved on, leaving behind men who remembered her as both enchanting and cruel. To Pauline, love was less a commitment than a game, less a bond than a flame that must be kindled again and again. And yet, perhaps within this restlessness was a hidden wound, the memory of loss, the hunger born in Marseille, the exile that left her always searching for a permanence she could never find. Paris delighted in her scandals. In the glittering world of Napoleon's empire, where etiquette was strict and appearances carefully maintained, Pauline was the exception. She could be reckless, even shameless, yet still forgiven, excused, indulged. Some said it was her brother's protection that shielded her. Others insisted it was her beauty alone, a force too powerful to condemn. And so, even as whispers spread, she continued to dance, to laugh, to welcome lovers into her orbit. She lived as though society's rules were written for others, not for her. Rome, by contrast, recoiled. The Borghese family, steeped in centuries of dignity, struggled under the weight of her behavior. Pauline did not care. If anything, their disapproval seemed to amuse her. She mocked solemnity, turned propriety into parody. When confronted with reproach, she answered with laughter, a laughter that unsettled those who wished to bind her with rules. Her very existence in their halls was a challenge, a reminder that beauty, when married to audacity, could defy even the heaviest traditions. And so the scent of perfume thickened, mingling with the rustle of curtains drawn shut, with the silence that follows a door closing softly at night. In these moments, Pauline's life unfolded not in official decrees or noble ceremonies, but in glances, in touches, in the half-light of secrecy. It is tempting to ask whether she sought in these lovers true connection or only diversion. Did she ever love deeply, or did she love only the sensation of being loved? The answer, like much of her life, remains obscured, lost in the haze of rumor and memory. There were darker whispers, too, suggestions that her indulgences were more than mere passion, that they bordered on excess, on recklessness that shocked even those accustomed to scandal. Some claimed she delighted in shocking propriety for its own sake, that her affairs were as much acts of defiance as of desire. Others spoke of her as vulnerable, a woman who sought endlessly because she could never truly find satisfaction. Between these extremes lies the mystery of Pauline herself. Was she goddess or child, seductress or wanderer, free spirit or prisoner of her own beauty? Her brother Napoleon, though stern with others, continued to excuse her. He seemed blind to her excesses, or perhaps simply unwilling to confront them fully. To some, this indulgence hinted at an intimacy beyond the ordinary, a closeness that would feed rumors of incest. Yet for Pauline, perhaps it was only the assurance that her brother, for all his power and distance, would never abandon her. In a world where lovers came and went, where husbands turned to estrangement, Napoleon remained her anchor, the one man whose gaze never wavered, even when others judged. The midnight chamber grows quiet now, its perfume lingering in the air even after the curtains have been drawn. Beyond the chamber lies the world of rumor and shadow, where whispers take on darker tones, where admiration gives way to suspicion. And from the silence of these secret rooms rises the strangest murmur of all, the suggestion that Pauline's closeness to Napoleon was more than sisterly, that their bond carried with it an intimacy unspoken, half denied, half believed, and forever unresolved. The strangest murmur of all, drifting from chamber to salon, was the suggestion that the bond between Pauline Bonaparte and her brother Napoleon carried an intimacy beyond the realm of siblings. Whispers of incest are among the oldest and most dangerous of human rumors, for they strike at the foundations of family and morality alike, and yet such whispers followed Pauline wherever she went. They were never spoken loudly in public, seldom written in official records, but in quiet corners, behind fluttering fans and beneath the weight of candle-lit chandeliers. The question lingered: was Pauline's devotion to her brother of an ordinary kind, or did it slip into something darker, something unspoken yet felt by all? What gave life to these rumors was not any single act, but the accumulation of Pauline's defiance, her indifference to propriety, and Napoleon's indulgence of her. She was the only one among his sisters who could laugh at him without consequence, who could tease him when others trembled in his presence. When courtiers bowed stiffly before the emperor, Pauline could smile and speak with a familiarity that unsettled observers. She defied etiquette in his presence, reclining casually, speaking freely, yet instead of reprimand, she met with his toleration, even amusement. Such intimacy was startling to those who feared Napoleon's wrath, and from their astonishment the whispers grew. Pauline's devotion to her brother was evident in ways that were undeniable. When others in the family quarreled or distanced themselves, she remained loyal. She defended him against criticism, traveled to see him in exile, and gave of her own wealth to ease his hardships when his empire fell. This loyalty, uncommon in a family often torn by ambition, made her seem singular among the Bonapartes. Was it pure devotion, or did it conceal something more? Society, always hungry for scandal, chose the darker interpretation. Yet if one pauses to reflect, the picture becomes less certain. Pauline was a woman who sought attention, whose beauty had been both her fortune and her burden. Napoleon was a man who commanded the attention of the world, who reshaped Europe with his ambition. For Pauline, to be close to him was to be at the center of power, the heart of destiny. Her affection may have been as much for his aura as for his person. And for Napoleon, accustomed to loyalty that was often calculated, Pauline's reckless devotion may have felt uniquely genuine. Perhaps their bond was no more scandalous than the union of two natures, each finding in the other what they lacked. She gave him warmth, he gave her security. The rest may be no more than shadow. Still, the shadow was persistent. When Pauline lingered at his side too long, when she jested with him too freely, when she appeared at his court adorned more like a courtesan than a princess, the whispers rose again. They were fed by her own provocations, for Pauline seemed at times to delight in scandal, as though she knew that whispers only heightened her allure. Did she ever consider how deeply such rumors might wound her? Or did she simply brush them aside as part of the price of living as she chose? Her laughter suggests the latter, yet one wonders whether in her solitude the weight of those murmurs pressed heavier than she let on. It is tempting to seek certainty in such matters, but certainty eludes us. The truth of their bond remains veiled, half in history, half in rumor. What can be said is that Pauline was, in all ways, closer to Napoleon than any of his other sisters. She followed him in triumph and in ruin. She remained loyal when others faltered, and she seemed always to carry him in her heart. Whether that loyalty crossed the invisible boundary whispered about by society, we cannot know. And perhaps it is fitting that we do not know, for mystery has always been at the heart of Pauline's legend. The strangeness of this murmur lies not only in its content, but in its endurance. Long after Pauline was gone, long after Napoleon's empire crumbled into history, the rumor lingered. It clung to their names, woven into the tapestry of myth that surrounds the Bonapartes. Even today, when scholars seek to untangle fact from gossip, the question remains unresolved. It is less a statement about Pauline herself than a reflection of how beauty and power, when joined, inevitably draw suspicion. Imagine the silence of a room where Pauline reclines in laughter beside her brother, courtiers shifting uneasily, uncertain where admiration ends and scandal begins. The silence is heavy, filled with unanswered questions, filled with gazes that dare not speak. In that silence lies the truth of the rumor, not in any act, but in the tension, the ambiguity, the space between what is seen and what is feared. And so the question remains, unanswered, unresolved, suspended like a breath, never exhaled. Did Pauline and Napoleon share more than blood, or was the world simply unable to comprehend a woman who lived so freely and a man who tolerated her as he tolerated no other? The silence offers no reply. From that silence, the scene shifts. The heavy air of rumor gives way to the glitter of Paris once more, to salons filled with candlelight and music, to Pauline moving among guests like a flame among moths. Her scandals did not end with whispers of intimacy. They multiplied, transformed, renewed themselves in dances, in laughter, in the shimmer of candlelight across polished mirrors. The shimmer of candlelight across polished mirrors opens before us now, casting its golden glow upon the grand salons of Napoleonic Paris. Here Pauline Bonaparte moved as though she were both queen and courtesan, the sister of the emperor yet untamed by the formality of his court. While others walked stiffly, measured by rules and etiquette, Pauline drifted through the rooms like music itself, weaving laughter and glances into a spell that unsettled and enchanted in equal measure. These were the years when her presence at balls and receptions became a spectacle of their own, when her very arrival drew eyes away from generals, ministers, and even empresses. She was a flame, dazzling and dangerous, consuming the gaze of all who entered her orbit. The halls were vast, hung with draperies that smelled faintly of incense and smoke, chandeliers blazing above with hundreds of candles that set the mirrors ablaze with reflections. Men in uniforms bright with medals, women in gowns heavy with jewels, all gathered to honor the empire that Napoleon had conjured out of revolution. Yet amid this splendor, Pauline shone with a brilliance that seemed independent of circumstance. Draped in silks cut daringly low, adorned with diamonds or pearls, she did not simply wear her garments, she transformed them, turned fabric and jewel into extensions of her presence. The courtiers could not help but speak of her afterward, some with admiration, others with disdain, yet always with fascination. She danced often, and when she did, it was as if the music itself had been written for her. The rustle of her gown, the sweep of her steps, the subtle tilt of her head, each movement carried a rhythm that seemed to draw the room closer. Those who partnered with her later recalled the sensation of being both exalted and diminished, for while she offered her hand, her smile, her nearness, it was clear she belonged not to them, but to the moment itself. Pauline was always half present and half beyond reach, a woman who gave enough to intoxicate but never enough to satisfy. At times she presided over gatherings of her own, where intimacy replaced grandeur, where laughter rang louder than formality. These were not the solemn receptions of her sister-in-law, Empress Josephine, but spaces of indulgence where Pauline created an atmosphere of warmth and recklessness that suited her nature. In these smaller gatherings, perfume and wine mingled in the air, conversations tumbled into laughter, and the rigidity of the empire softened into something more human. To be invited was to enter a world where propriety dissolved, where one could imagine, even briefly, that life was made for pleasure. Yet beneath the glitter and laughter, the shadow of scandal was never far. Pauline's affairs continued, woven into the fabric of her social presence. Admirers whispered her name with longing, detractors sharpened their tongues on her improprieties. She did little to defend herself, for she seemed almost amused by the chatter. Her beauty, her charm, her audacity, these, she knew, were weapons sharper than words, and she wielded them without hesitation. In a court where Napoleon demanded strict order, Pauline remained a paradox. indulged, forgiven, untouchable, even when her behavior threatened to shame the family. Her bond with Napoleon was part of this paradox. At formal gatherings, he presided with the gravity of an emperor, while she floated with the ease of a goddess. The contrast was striking, and it heightened the rumors that clung to them both. For those who feared Napoleon's authority, Pauline's freedom in his presence was inexplicable. She could laugh at him, interrupt him, tease him openly, and instead of punishment, she received indulgence. Observers, unsettled by this imbalance, whispered once more of intimacy, of secrets unspoken. Yet perhaps what truly lay between them was something simpler and more profound. She offered him a fragment of the Corsican past, of family unburdened by titles, of warmth untainted by ambition. He, in turn, offered her a shield against judgment, the assurance that she, unlike others, could never truly fall. The candlelit mirrors reflected all of this, the shimmer of jewels, the laughter of guests, the whispers that curled like smoke in the air. And as the nights passed, as Pauline danced and laughed and defied, she deepened her legend. She was not merely a hostess, not merely a sister of the emperor. She was a symbol of the empire's contradictions, grandeur and scandal, discipline and indulgence, power and fragility. And yet, as with all things that burn too brightly, the danger of extinguishment hovered near. Pauline's health, fragile since her youth, was strained by her restless indulgence. She masked her weakness with silks and perfumes, but behind the mirrors lay the reality of fevers, of fatigue, of a body that could not always sustain the fire of her spirit. Even in her moments of triumph, the shadow of frailty lingered, like a note of dissonance in a song. As the last candle of an evening flickers, as the harpist plucks a final string, there is a sudden sharp sound, the faint snap of a harp string breaking. The music ceases, leaving silence that feels heavier than all the laughter that came before. In that silence lies the truth of Pauline's life, brilliance that dazzled, yet always balanced on the edge of fragility, a beauty that seemed eternal yet was bound to the weakness of mortal flesh. The broken string quivers still, its echo fading. And from that silence rises the next moment, the muffled sound of labored breath in a chamber draped with velvet, where Pauline's body, so radiant in dance, reveals the weakness hidden beneath her silks. The muffled sound of labored breath in a chamber draped with velvet lies now before us, as if the harp string that snapped in the ballroom has followed Pauline into her solitude. For beneath the brilliance of jewels and the shimmer of candle-lit mirrors, Pauline Bonaparte carried within her a body that betrayed her as often as it obeyed. Illness clung to her life like a shadow, sometimes faint, sometimes overwhelming, but never absent. Even as she dazzled society, she was haunted by weakness, by fevers that returned without warning, by aches that confined her to bed, by a frailty that stood in stark contrast to the vitality she displayed in public. In those velvet-draped chambers, the sounds of her weakness were hidden from the crowds who adored her. The cough into a silk handkerchief, the restless stirring on sheets scented with lavender, the whispered instructions to attendants, all belonged to a Pauline unseen by the world. Yet these moments were as real as the laughter in salons, and perhaps more honest. For beauty, no matter how radiant, cannot entirely mask the truth of the body's decline. She was fragile, though she refused to live as though fragility defined her. Letters and accounts from those who attended her often spoke of her languor, her frequent need to withdraw, her retreats from the very pleasures that seemed to sustain her. One moment she was the goddess of the ballroom, her eyes sparkling with mischief. The next she was cloistered in her chamber, curtains drawn against the light, her breathing shallow, her skin pale against the richness of her cushions. It was as if Pauline lived always between extremes, excess and collapse, laughter and silence, vitality and weakness, What illness plagued her exactly, we cannot say with certainty. Some spoke of tuberculosis, others of syphilis, still others of an undefined frailty inherited from childhood. Physicians came and went, offering treatments more ritual than remedy, tonics, bleeding, powders of doubtful origin. The empire's best doctors could not cure what lay at her core. And so Pauline learned to live with her ailments, to weave them into her life as she wove jewels into her gowns. She bore them with the same defiance with which she bore scandal, refusing to allow them to silence her spirit. Yet illness also shaped her choices. The restless pursuit of pleasure, the indulgence in lovers, the reckless laughter. Perhaps these were not only defiance, but also urgency. To live in a body that threatened to fail at any time is to know the fragility of existence, to feel the need to seize each moment before it fades. Pauline seemed to understand this instinctively. She lived as though each dance might be her last, each glance her only chance, each embrace her final taste of life. And perhaps this explains why she was never satisfied, why she always sought more. For when time feels uncertain, enough can never truly be enough. Her attendants, those who saw her in illness, described her as both imperious and vulnerable. She demanded comfort, demanded care, as though illness gave her license to command even more than usual. Yet in her weakness, there was also a childlike quality, a need for reassurance, a fear of being abandoned in her suffering. Lovers could flatter her in salons, but in her chamber, it was her attendants, her physicians, and her family who witnessed her fragility. And of her family, it was Napoleon whose presence mattered most. His visits, rare but profound, brought her comfort. In his sternness, she found security, in his ambition a shield against the smallness of sickness. To lie weak in bed while her brother shaped empires must have been a paradox she felt keenly. In these years, her illness also became part of her allure. The contrast between her fragile health and her sensual presence deepened the fascination others felt for her. She was both strong and weak, both goddess and patient. Men desired her not only for her beauty, but for the aura of delicacy that clung to her, the sense that she was both untouchable and in need of protection. This duality heightened her legend, for it made her seem less mortal, more like a figure from myth, Venus who could fall ill, yet never lose her radiance. But Pauline herself must have felt the weight of it. Did she ever fear that her beauty would fade, that illness would strip away the one gift that had defined her life? Did she ever look into her mirror, her face pale from fever, and wonder if the goddess carved in marble would outlive the woman of flesh? Such questions remain unanswerable, yet the very presence of Canova's statue suggests she understood. In allowing herself to be immortalized in stone, she secured a version of herself untouched by sickness, untouched by time. The sound of labored breath fills the chamber still, soft and uneven. Yet even as illness pressed upon her, Pauline did not retreat into piety or renunciation. She returned again and again to salons, to laughter, to the arms of admirers. Illness may have slowed her, but it never silenced her. She would not be reduced to fragility alone. She insisted on living, on burning brightly, even when her body dimmed. And so, from the silence of the sick room, from the velvet curtains and the scented cushions, a new sound rises. It is the rustle of travel cloaks in the sea wind, for Pauline, frail though she often was, would summon her strength to journey once more, this time to the side of her brother in exile. Illness could weaken her body, but it could not diminish her loyalty. When Napoleon fell, Pauline did not hesitate to follow him into his decline, carrying with her jewels, devotion, and the same unquenchable spirit that defied both sickness and scandal. The rustle of travel cloaks in sea winds carries us now across waters toward the rocky island of Elba, where Pauline Bonaparte, fragile in health yet unyielding in loyalty, chose to follow her brother into exile. It was 1814, and Napoleon, the emperor who had shaken Europe with his ambition, was cast down, confined to a small corner of the Mediterranean. Many who once courted his favor now abandoned him, seeking safety in distance. Yet Pauline, his scandalous and indulgent sister, surprised the world by showing a devotion unmatched even by those whose fortunes had depended entirely upon his reign. She left behind the glitter of Paris and Rome, carrying with her not only her jewels and possessions, but also the determination to stand beside him when nearly everyone else turned away. The journey itself was not easy. Her body, already weakened by years of illness, protested the roughness of travel. The sea air, sharp with salt, stung her lungs. The tossing of the vessel left her pale and restless. Yet Pauline bore it, perhaps with more courage than many would have expected, for her loyalty to Napoleon was not born of duty alone. It was born of that strange closeness that had bound them since youth, a mixture of affection, admiration, and dependence that defied easy explanation. As waves crashed against the vessel's hull, one imagines her seated among her attendants, her cloak drawn tight, her gaze fixed on the horizon, thinking not of her own discomfort but of the brother awaiting her on that rocky shore. Elba was no palace of marble nor salon of mirrors. It was an island both barren and beautiful, its hills rough, its villages simple, its air filled with the cries of gulls. For Napoleon, it was both prison and refuge, a stage far smaller than the empire he once commanded. And into this reduced world stepped Pauline, bringing with her the memory of grandeur, the scent of perfumes, the sparkle of diamonds. She arrived not as a mourner, but as a sister, determined to bring light into exile. In her presence, the island seemed less desolate, as though even in disgrace Napoleon could not entirely escape the aura of power. For his sister, Venus of Canova, Scandal of Salons, was still at his side. Accounts speak of her generosity during this time. She sold jewels to provide comfort for Napoleon, ensuring he was not left in want. She arranged gatherings, small but elegant, that softened the bleakness of exile. She walked with him, listened to him, reminded him of their shared past in Corsica, long before emperors and crowns. To the outside world, this devotion seemed extraordinary. Some whispered again of intimacy, unable to accept such loyalty without suspicion. Yet perhaps what bound her to him was simpler. He had been the one constant in her life of restless indulgence, the one figure who never abandoned her despite scandal, who always indulged her excesses. In his fall, she repaid his constancy with her own. And yet Elba was not without its contradictions. Pauline's taste for luxury did not vanish. She traveled with a retinue, with gowns and jewels, with attendants who fussed over her. Even in exile, she sought beauty, creating islands of refinement in a place meant for punishment. This, too, was Pauline, incapable of living without adornment, even when surrounded by ruin. To her, luxury was not vanity but necessity, as essential as breath. And so, even on Elba, her chambers carried the scent of lavender, her gowns rustled with silk, her laughter broke the monotony of days. For Napoleon, her presence was more than comfort. It was validation. Others had abandoned him, but Pauline's devotion reminded him he was not entirely forsaken. To have at his side the sister most associated with scandal, with defiance, with audacity, may have seemed paradoxical. Yet perhaps it was fitting. Pauline embodied the vitality of the Bonapartes, the refusal to bow even when the world demanded it. In her loyalty, Napoleon found both solace and pride. There were moments, too, of quiet between them. Imagine the two of them seated on a terrace, the sea stretching endlessly before them, the wind carrying the scent of salt and pine. Pauline, her health frail, wrapped in shawls, her eyes bright despite weariness. Napoleon, restless, pacing, speaking of plans, of return, of destiny not yet finished. She listening, smiling, encouraging. perhaps not caring whether the dreams were possible, only that they were spoken. These moments suspended between ruin and hope, between exile and empire, capture something essential about their bond. In time, the world would be startled by Napoleon's escape from Elba, by his return to France, by the 100 days that followed. Pauline, too, would be part of that strange interlude, her loyalty carrying her into yet another chapter of triumph and disaster. But in Elba, her devotion shone most clearly, for it was here that she had nothing to gain, no advantage to secure, only the comfort of her brother in defeat. The rustle of travel cloaks settles now, the sea wind fading into stillness. And in that stillness, another sound rises, the tolling of a ship's bell, distant and solemn, announcing not only journeys across water, but also the passage of time, the inevitability of change. That bell will carry us into the next moment, the 100 days when Napoleon, once confined, once fallen, sees destiny again, only to see it slip from his grasp at Waterloo, leaving Pauline once more in the shadow of his fate. The tolling of a ship's bell fades into silence, and in that silence begins the strange interlude known as the 100 Days, when Napoleon slipped the bonds of Elba and reclaimed, for a brief and blazing span, the throne of France. The news of his escape spread like fire through Europe, and where others trembled at the thought of renewed war, Pauline's heart quickened with devotion. She had stood beside him in exile, had soothed his despair with laughter and loyalty, and now she watched him stride once more into destiny. The air was thick with uncertainty, but for Pauline, uncertainty was no stranger. Her life had always been woven of fleeting moments, of pleasures seized before they dissolved, and so this sudden return must have felt almost natural to her spirit, a final indulgence of fate itself. Napoleon's march through France, gathering support as he advanced on Paris, became legend. Soldiers who had sworn allegiance to the restored Bourbon king turned at his approach, as if drawn by an unseen force. For Pauline, this return must have carried both pride and dread. Pride, for her brother was again master of his fate, defying the kings of Europe. Dread, for she must have sensed that such a blaze could not last, that empires do not rise twice without paying a heavy price. Still, she gave her loyalty freely, offering jewels once more to support his cause, offering words of encouragement, offering herself as the sister who never faltered. In Paris, as the empire flared into being again, Pauline's presence was both dazzling and unsettling. She attended gatherings with the same grace as before, though the air was heavier now, thick with the knowledge that every dance, every conversation, every flicker of candlelight might be the last before the storm. Courtiers who had once whispered behind her back now whispered with greater urgency, for all knew that Europe was preparing to strike. And still, Pauline moved among them, her beauty undiminished, her laughter carrying across the room like a defiance of the coming darkness. It is said that she believed, or wished to believe, that Napoleon's star could never truly fall. To her, his very presence was destiny, and she clung to that certainty even as others doubted. Did she imagine that his return would endure, that the glory of the empire could be restored? Or did she know in her heart that this was only a brief reprieve, another fleeting indulgence before the final silence? We cannot know, but we can imagine her, seated before a mirror as she prepared for yet another evening, her jewels catching the light, her face pale yet serene, whispering to herself that loyalty mattered more than outcome. Then came Waterloo, the battle that ended not only the 100 Days but also Napoleon's reign, the battle that scattered his armies and left him at the mercy of his enemies. News traveled swiftly, carried on the wind of rumor before it was confirmed in letters. Pauline, hearing it, must have felt the world tilt beneath her. The silence that followed was heavier than any she had known, heavier even than the silence of Saint-Domingue's fevered nights. Waterloo was not only defeat, it was finality. It was the end of her brother's empire, the end of the dream that had shaped her own life. In that silence, Pauline's loyalty did not waver. While others abandoned Napoleon once more, seeking favor with the victors, she continued to defend him. She spoke of his greatness, of his destiny, of her pride in being his sister. She sought to ease his suffering, to provide what comfort she could, even as exile loomed again, this time to a place far more distant and final than Elba. Her devotion in this moment stands as one of the most striking contrasts of her life. The woman known for lovers, for scandals, for reckless indulgence, became, in the end, the sister who remained when nearly all others turned away. Imagine her chambers in those days after Waterloo. The jewels laid aside, the gowns untouched, the mirrors covered as though to shield her from her own reflection, the air heavy with grief, not only for her brother's fate but for her own, for with his fall came the collapse of the world in which she had thrived. No salons, no glittering balls, no indulgence could erase the silence that followed the news of Waterloo. For Pauline, who had always lived in the present itself had shattered, and yet she did not retreat into despair. Even in this darkest moment, she clung to her loyalty as though it were the one truth she could still claim. She offered her wealth, her influence, her presence, to ease Napoleon's path. She could not save him from St. Helena, that distant island prison, but she could show him that he was not entirely forsaken. Perhaps this was her final act of defiance, not against propriety nor against convention, but against abandonment itself. The silence after Waterloo remains in memory, an echo heavier than drums of victory or songs of triumph. It is the silence of an empire's end, of a sister's devotion, of a world that would never be restored. And from that silence rises a new sound, the slow scratching of a pen across paper, ink drying on a sealed letter. For as the empire collapsed, words became the last connection, letters carrying loyalty across distance, across seas, across the widening gulf between Pauline and her brother's fate. The ink dries upon the sealed letter, its black trace sinking into the fibers of paper, carrying words that can no longer bridge the vast distance between exile and memory. For Napoleon was carried far from Europe, far from Elba's proximity to the familiar Mediterranean, to the remote rock of St. Helena, where no sister, no admirer, no army could reach him. Pauline, who had followed him through triumph and fall, who had offered jewels and loyalty when others fled, could not follow this final journey. Instead, she remained in Europe, her life turning slowly inward, her world contracting even as her legend continued to expand in whispers. It was in Rome that she settled once more, returning to the Borghese palaces with their marble corridors and frescoed ceilings, palaces that had never truly felt like home. Yet now, with the empire gone, with Napoleon imprisoned beyond reach, those halls became her refuge and her prison alike. The salons of Paris were lost to her, the dances and mirrors now echoes of another life. In their place was the echo of deserted halls, the silence of rooms that had once judged her with disdain, but now absorbed her quietly, as though the weight of scandal no longer mattered in the face of history's finality. Pauline, once draped in gowns that dazzled the eye, appeared now more often in simple attire, her health declining, her strength fading. She had never been a woman of restraint, and yet age and illness began to impose what discipline she'd always resisted. The laughter that had once spilled so easily from her lips grew rarer, softer, tinged with fatigue. She withdrew more often into private rooms, away from the eyes of those who had both adored and condemned her. The courtesan goddess of salons was becoming a shadow, though even in shadow her beauty lingered, startling to those who glimpsed her still. In Rome, Her reputation clung to her like a veil she could not remove. Neighbors and nobles recalled her scandalous posing for Canova, her lovers, her laughter in Paris. Some visited her with curiosity, others with the chill courtesy of obligation. Yet Pauline seemed less concerned with their judgment now. She had lived as she pleased, and with her brother gone into unreachable exile, the whispers of society held little weight. She turned her attention inward, to her health, to her memories, to the few bonds that still sustained her. Camillo Borghese, her husband, had long since drifted from her life. Their union, never filled with affection, had become little more than a legal tie, endured rather than cherished. Pauline no longer sought his approval, no longer sought to shock him with defiance. She lived largely apart, her household her own, her attendants her companions. The great Borghese palaces, once resistant to her, seemed now to absorb her presence as one absorbs the passage of time, inevitable, unresisted. Her illness deepened in these years. The fevers grew more frequent, the weakness more persistent. The woman who had once seemed to dance endlessly now struggled to cross her chambers. Physicians were summoned again, offering the same futile remedies, powders, tinctures, prayers disguised as science. Pauline bore it with a curious mixture of imperiousness and resignation. She commanded her attendants still, demanding comfort, demanding attention. Yet she also seemed to know that her strength was fading, that no physician could restore what time and indulgence had taken. And yet, in her decline, there was a quiet dignity. She did not rage against the loss of beauty, though she must have felt it keenly. She accepted that the goddess in marble would outlive the woman of flesh, that her immortality had already been secured by Canova's chisel. Perhaps she even took comfort in it, knowing that long after her voice and laughter faded, her image would remain, serene and victorious, untouched by illness. The world beyond her chambers moved on. Napoleon's death in 1821 reached her in Rome, the final severing of the bond that had shaped her life. She grieved, not with public displays, but with a private sorrow that few could see. For all their whispers, for all their speculation, Pauline's devotion to her brother had been true, and his loss left her more adrift than ever. Without him, the center of her world dissolved. She was no longer Napoleon's sister in triumph, nor his companion in exile. She was simply Pauline, alone in marble halls, her legend already fading into history. Imagine the shutter of a window closing softly in the Roman dusk, the last light of the sun slipping away from frescoed walls. The echo of deserted salons lingers in that sound, the sense of an era ended, of brilliance dimmed, of beauty retreating into shadow. And as the shutters close, dust begins to gather, not only on the unused jewels and the covered mirrors, but on the very memory of scandal, as though Pauline herself were being folded slowly into the silence of the past. Dust gathers on unused jewels, each stone dulled not by the passage of centuries, but by the neglect of their mistress, who once wore them as naturally as breath. In Pauline Bonaparte's final years, the jewels remained in boxes, the mirrors in her chambers often draped in black cloth, as though she could not bear to see the fading of the beauty that had once ruled salons and whispered itself into every corner of Europe. Her health, never strong, now waned steadily, leaving her frailer with each passing season. The woman who had danced until dawn, who had laughed with a defiance that unsettled empresses and cardinals, now moved rarely from her bed, her spirit still restless, though her body betrayed her. Visitors who saw her in these years remarked upon the contrast. The goddess who had reclined in Canova's marble was still visible in her features, yet shadowed by sickness. Her skin pale, her figure diminished. She retained the grace of movement, the curve of a smile, but they were muted, softened by fatigue. Some pitied her, others admired her still, for beauty, even in decline, has a way of leaving traces that illness cannot erase. But Pauline herself must have felt the loss more keenly than anyone. To live a life so entwined with admiration and then to see one's own reflection dim was to face a sorrow beyond pain, a sorrow that touches the very essence of identity. And yet she did not wholly surrender to despair. Even as illness deepened, she surrounded herself with the remnants of pleasure. Perfume still lingered on her cushions, silk still clothed her frail form, attendants still flattered and comforted her. She demanded warmth, demanded softness, demanded that life continue to indulge her, even as her strength waned. In this insistence lay the core of Pauline's nature. She had never accepted limits, and she would not accept them now, not even from her own body. Still, solitude pressed heavily. The lovers and admirers who once filled her life were gone, faded like the glitter of old salons. Her husband, Camillo Borghese, remained distant, their estrangement long established. Her brother Napoleon, the one constant of her loyalty, had died far away on St. Helena, his empire reduced to legend. Without him, Pauline's world seemed smaller, her anchor gone. She was left with memories that glimmered like jewels now hidden in dust, memories of laughter, of scandal, of indulgence, of devotion. In the quiet of her chambers, those memories must have returned often, flickering like candlelight in the recesses of her mind. It is said that she began to turn more seriously toward religion in her last years. The woman who had lived as Venus seemed to seek, at last, a measure of reconciliation with the church she had often mocked by her scandalous ways. Confessors visited her, priests offered prayers, and Pauline, whether out of genuine faith or a final attempt at peace, listened. Perhaps she found comfort in their words. Perhaps she merely played once more the role expected of her. But one imagines that even in prayer, she remained Pauline, restless, sensuous, never wholly subdued. Her faith, if it came, was like her laughter, real in the moment, yet touched by ambiguity. The image of dust gathering on jewels carries with it the sense of time's inevitability. Pauline, once the glitter of Europe, was now a woman alone, her beauty waning, her strength failing. Yet the jewels, though unused, remained. They did not cease to exist simply because she no longer wore them. In the same way, her legend, though muted in her final days, did not vanish. It lingered, waiting to be remembered, waiting to outlive her. Perhaps she sensed this. Perhaps that is why she allowed her mirrors to be covered, not out of denial, but out of certainty that she no longer needed them. Her reflection had already been secured forever in marble. Her attendants recalled that in these last years she would sometimes hold small objects from her past, a ribbon, a miniature portrait, a jewel, and gaze at them silently, as though communing not with the object itself, but with the life it represented. In those silences, one wonders what thoughts passed through her mind. Did she regret her indulgence? Did she regret the scandals, the lovers, the whispers? Or did she smile inwardly, content that she had lived as she wished, that she had seized each moment, that she had refused to be bound by convention? Her life, like her gaze in Canova's statue, seemed always to turn slightly away, indifferent to judgment. In the end, illness confined her more than society ever could. The woman who once defied Europe now lay in silence, her breath uneven, her strength dwindling. Yet even here, in her decline, she remained unforgettable. Those who served her remembered not only her demands and her frailty, but also her moments of tenderness, her sudden laughter, her flashes of warmth. She was not simply a goddess brought low. She was a woman who carried her contradictions to the very end. And so the dust thickens on the unused jewels, settling not only on stones, but on memory itself. From that dust rises a new sound, the distant toll of church bells, echoing across Roman streets, solemn and slow. They call not only to the faithful at prayer, but also to Pauline herself, who begins at last to listen, her spirit drawn toward reconciliation, her restless life turning toward its final chapter. The solemn toll of church bells drifts across the Roman streets, their sound deep and lingering, carrying into the quiet chambers where Pauline Bonaparte lay in her decline. For a woman whose life had been filled with laughter, scandal, and the ceaseless pursuit of pleasure, the bells must have sounded both foreign and familiar. Foreign because they spoke of restraint, of repentance, of an order she had so often defied. Familiar because they had always been present in the background of her life, ringing in Corsican villages, in Parisian squares, in Roman piazzas, reminders of a faith that no scandal could ever fully erase. Now, as her body weakened and her days shortened, she listened to them with new ears, hearing in their toll a rhythm that seemed to call her toward something she had long postponed: reconciliation, reflection, perhaps even peace. The Pauline who once posed as Venus Victrix, who once filled her chambers with perfume and laughter, was still present, but she was muted, softened by illness and time. The silk gowns remained, the jewels still glittered in their cases, yet they no longer carried the same meaning. In her final years, she began to turn more seriously toward the church she had once mocked with her audacity. Confessors came to her bedside, offering prayers and counsel. At first, perhaps, she received them with the same playful indifference she had shown in salons, teasing, deflecting, reluctant to surrender her independence. But as her strength ebbed, her resistance softened. The woman who had defied convention her entire life began to lean toward the rituals of faith, not out of fear alone, but perhaps out of a desire for completion, for a final gesture that would bind together the contradictions of her existence. There is something profoundly human in this turn. Pauline had lived as though she were untouchable, her beauty a shield against judgment, her laughter a dismissal of consequence. Yet when faced with mortality, she did as countless others before her had done. She sought solace in faith, in the hope that indulgence could be forgiven, that scandal could be washed clean, that the soul could rest even when the body had lived recklessly. And yet, one must wonder whether her faith was as absolute as the priests wished to believe, or whether it was touched still by ambiguity. Did she truly repent, or did she, even in prayer, smile with that same mischievous curve of her lips, knowing she had lived as few dared to live? The bells tolled not only for her, but for the passage of an era. Napoleon was gone, his empire dissolved into history. Her sisters and brothers scattered, their fortunes altered, their names carried forward with varying shades of triumph and disgrace. Pauline, once at the center of it all, was now a solitary figure, remembered more for her beauty and scandal than for any political power. In the quiet of her chambers, she must have felt the distance between her past and her present, the gulf between the dazzling goddess of Canova's marble and the frail woman who lay listening to the bells. Perhaps she thought of Corsica, of the olive groves and the salt winds of Ajaccio, where her story began. Perhaps she thought of Marseille, of hunger and exile, when she first learned that beauty could be both burden and weapon. Perhaps she thought of Paris, of dances and mirrors, of lovers and whispers, of laughter that drowned out judgment. Perhaps she thought of Elba, of her brother's weary eyes, of her own devotion when nearly all others turned away. Her life was not a straight line, but a tapestry of contradictions: devotion and scandal, vitality and frailty, goddess and penitent. Now, in the toll of the bells, she must have felt the strands pulling together, weaving her into the silence that awaited. The priests who attended her noted her gentleness in these final years, her willingness to receive the sacraments, her desire to make amends. They spoke of her as a woman reconciled, ready to leave behind the world of scandal. Yet others, remembering her past, doubted whether she could ever truly be subdued. The truth, as always with Pauline, lay in ambiguity. She was capable of sincerity, yet also of performance, capable of repentance, yet also of indulgence. To reduce her to one or the other would be to miss her essence. She was both, always both. The toll of church bells fades, leaving the faint murmur of prayers whispered but unfinished. Pauline's lips moved with them, though whether in devotion or in habit no one could say. Her attendants watched. Some moved to tears, others hardened by years of service, all aware that they were witnessing the final act of a woman who had once commanded rooms with a glance. The goddess was becoming mortal once more, the scandalous sister of an emperor becoming simply a soul, preparing to depart. Outside, the bells fell silent, leaving the air heavy, waiting. And in that waiting, another sound stirs, the cool touch of holy water dripping into a basin, ready to mark her with the sign of faith she had so long resisted, ready to usher her into her last days with a fragile dignity she had seldom embraced in life. The cool touch of holy water drips softly into the basin, its surface trembling in the dim light of Pauline Bonaparte's chamber. A priest raises his hand, the gesture deliberate, ancient, as he prepares to anoint the woman who once lived as Venus incarnate. The room is hushed, heavy with velvet curtains and the faint scent of burning wax, as though time itself has slowed to witness this transformation. Pauline, frail upon her bed, receives the blessing with eyes half closed, her face pale yet still marked by the delicate beauty that had once startled Europe. In this moment, scandal seems far away, reduced to whispers long dissolved into memory. What remains is a woman nearing her end, clinging not to lovers or jewels, but to the fragile dignity of faith. Her attendants stood quietly around her bed, watching with a reverence born of both awe and sorrow. They had seen her in laughter, in fury, in illness, in indulgence. They had seen her demand perfumes and silks even as fever racked her body. Now they saw her still, her hands folded lightly, her lips moving faintly with the words of prayer. The contrast was stark. Pauline, who once defied propriety with every gesture, now bowed her spirit, if not her will, before the rituals of the church. And yet even here, even in repentance, one sensed her ambiguity. Her expression carried not the solemnity of fear, but the serenity of one who has accepted, perhaps even chosen, the inevitability of death. Her illness had worsened beyond remedy. The fevers came more often, leaving her weaker with each passing day. Her breathing was shallow, each exhalation a whisper, each inhalation a labor. Physicians, long accustomed to her imperious commands, could do little but offer comfort. They brought tinctures. They spoke words of encouragement, but both they and she knew the truth. Her body was failing, and no amount of silks, perfumes, or laughter could change that. Pauline, who once seemed to live in defiance of mortality, now lay face to face with it, her spirit still restless, but her flesh unwilling. And yet she carried into these final days a fragile dignity that surprised even those closest to her. She was no longer the reckless hostess of Parisian salons, nor the scandal of Roman nobility. She was instead a woman stripped of adornment, seeking solace in the rituals she had once ignored. She confessed, she prayed, she accepted the sacraments. Some believed her transformation sincere, a true reconciliation after a life of indulgence. Others suspected it was another performance, a final gesture shaped by expectation rather than conviction. But perhaps the truth lies not in choosing one or the other. Pauline's life had always been lived in paradox, and her death was no different. She could be both penitent and defiant, both faithful and frivolous, both goddess and supplicant. There were moments of tenderness in those last days. Attendants recalled her speaking softly of Corsica, of the sea winds that had shaped her childhood. She remembered Napoleon, too, not as emperor but as brother, the boy she had once laughed with in Ajaccio, the man she had followed into exile. His death, years earlier on St. Helena, had left her adrift, but in these final days she seemed to feel him near again, as though the boundary between memory and presence had thinned. Perhaps she found comfort in imagining a reunion, beyond the reach of Europe's judgment, beyond the whispers of scandal, in a place where she and her brother might meet as they had once been, unburdened children of Corsica. Her faith, fragile though it was, gave shape to her final hours. The holy water, the murmured prayers, the cool touch of the cross upon her brow, these gestures enfolded her in a ritual older than empire, older than scandal, older than beauty itself. She, who had once been carved into marble as Venus Victrix, now allowed herself to be inscribed instead into the prayers of the faithful. In this shift lies not contradiction but completion, the final thread in a life woven of opposites. Imagine the chamber as night falls, the single flame of a candle flickering, casting long shadows across the frescoed ceiling. Pauline lies still, her breath faint, her eyes half closed. The priests withdraw, their prayers lingering in the air like incense. The attendants settle into silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of fabric, the quiet placing of a cup upon a table. In that silence, one senses the imminence of departure, the delicate boundary between presence and absence. Pauline, in those moments, may have reflected not on scandal but on beauty, the beauty of the olive groves of Corsica, of the chandeliers of Paris, of the marble halls of Rome, of the endless sea at Elba. Her life had been filled with contradictions, but in her memory they may have softened, blended into a single tapestry of sensation, light, scent, laughter, touch, loss. Perhaps she realized, as many do at the end, that life is not defined by judgment but by the fullness with which it was lived. And Pauline had lived fully, recklessly, beautifully, defiantly. The candle flickers lower, the air grows still, and the sound of her breath weakens. The fragile dignity of her final days lingers, a testament to a woman who could never be reduced to one meaning alone. And then, as if an echo of the candle's flame, there is a moment of guttering, a breath that falters, then ceases. The light in the chamber dims, leaving only shadow, only silence. The flicker of a candle guttering out marks her passing, the transition from scandal and beauty into memory and legend. The room holds its breath, as though aware that a chapter has closed, that a figure both worshipped and condemned has stepped beyond the reach of both praise and blame. The stillness after the candle's extinguishing holds the room in silence, the air heavy as stone, as though even the walls of the Borghese palace were aware that Pauline Bonaparte had departed from this world. No laughter now, no perfumes, no silks brushing the floor, only the faint scent of wax cooling into darkness. Those who had attended her last days moved quietly, their gestures subdued, their voices hushed, for they knew that whatever one might say of her in life, Pauline's passing was the closing of a chapter that had fascinated and unsettled Europe alike. She was only 44 years old, yet she seemed to carry in her departure the weight of an entire era. Napoleon's sister, Canova's Venus, Scandal's chosen child. News of her death spread swiftly, carried through the streets of Rome, whispered in Parisian salons, noted in letters across Europe. Some received it with pity, others with satisfaction, for scandalous lives always divide opinion. To her critics, she was a courtesan cloaked in titles, a woman who had shamed her husband and family, who had flaunted convention without remorse. To her admirers, she was a goddess of defiance, a woman who lived with rare audacity, who never allowed propriety to silence her spirit. In death, as in life, Pauline remained both condemned and celebrated, a figure impossible to define in one phrase. Her funeral was solemn, restrained, attended with the dignity her rank demanded. Yet even here one imagines that whispers lingered among the mourners, whispers of Canova's statue, of her lovers, of her devotion to Napoleon. The coffin that carried her frail body was draped with the symbols of nobility, but her true legacy lay not in heraldry, nor in marble halls. It lay in memory, in the contradictions she embodied, in the stories told long after the prayers of the funeral faded into silence. And there was, above all, the statue. Canova's Venus Victrix remained, carved in immortal marble, her body reclined in triumph, her face serene, her form unbroken by illness or time. Visitors to the Borghese Gallery stood before it in awe. Some scandalized, others enchanted. It was not merely a sculpture. It was Pauline herself, preserved at the height of her beauty, indifferent to judgment. The living woman was gone, but the marble remained, a goddess forever victorious. In this, Pauline had achieved what she seemed always to desire, not only to be admired, not only to be loved, but to be remembered, unforgotten, immortal. The dust of the years soon gathered over her absence, yet the whispers endured. In the courts of Europe, her name was spoken with both derision and fascination. Stories multiplied, some true, many exaggerated, all feeding the legend. She was remembered as Napoleon's most scandalous sister, as the woman who had reclined for Canova, as the beauty who had shocked Rome, as the loyal companion who had followed her brother even into exile. Each version told only part of the truth, yet together they wove the tapestry of her legend, rich and ambiguous. There is something haunting in how quickly scandal becomes memory, and memory becomes myth. Pauline, who once breathed and laughed and coughed in silken chambers, became in time no longer flesh, but story. People forgot the sound of her voice, the exact shade of her eyes, the weight of her presence in a room. What remained was the image, the reclining Venus, the whispered rumors of lovers, the loyalty to Napoleon. History, selective and unforgiving, reduced her to fragments, leaving us to wonder how much of her true self we have lost. And yet the fragments are powerful, for to speak of Pauline even now is to stir curiosity, to feel the shadow of her defiance, the shimmer of her allure. She was not merely an ornament of her brother's empire, nor merely a scandal to be gossiped about. She was a woman who lived with intensity, who refused to be confined, who bore her contradictions openly. In this way, she remains more vivid than many whose lives were outwardly more respectable, more orderly. Respectability fades quickly. Defiance lingers. Imagine the Borghese Gallery in the years after her death, the marble statue standing in its quiet hall, light falling softly upon its curves. Visitors enter, their footsteps echoing on stone, their voices lowered in awe or amusement. Some smile at the daring of it, others shake their heads in judgment, but all pause, all remember. The living Pauline is gone, yet here she reclines still, her body immortal, her gaze serene, her scandal eternal. The stillness of marble presses deeper, heavy as stone, and in that stillness, a new sound stirs, not laughter, not rumor, but the echo of a question that lingers unanswered. Was Pauline Bonaparte, in the end, redeemed by her beauty or condemned by it? Did she live freely, or was she imprisoned by the very power she wielded? The silence offers no answer. It leaves us only with the weight of stone and the sense that her life, like her statue, is frozen between defiance and serenity, scandal and immortality. The echo of that unanswered question lingers like a breath in a deserted gallery. Was Pauline Bonaparte redeemed by her beauty or condemned by it? Did she live as a free spirit or as a prisoner of her own allure? In the silence that follows, her memory spreads out like ripples across the surface of history, never still, always shifting. To some, she became a symbol of shameless indulgence. to others of loyalty and devotion. To all, she embodied the contradictions of her age, an age in which empires rose and fell, in which women were both confined by expectation and capable of unsettling entire societies simply by defying them. Pauline, half saint and half courtesan, lived at the heart of these contradictions, and in her, Napoleonic Europe saw both its promise and its peril. The Europe of her time was an uncertain place. Old monarchies had been toppled, new crowns fashioned, revolutions had shaken the foundations of society, and war had redrawn maps again and again. Amid this turbulence, the Bonapartes themselves were living symbols of change, a Corsican family of modest means who had risen to command thrones and armies. Pauline, as Napoleon's sister, shared in this transformation. Yet unlike her siblings, she did not measure herself in power or politics. She was no Caroline, scheming for advantage, no Elisa, ruling over Tuscany with a stern hand. Pauline measured herself in beauty, in presence, in the ability to captivate. Her stage was not the battlefield or the throne, but the salon, the ballroom, the sculptor's studio. And yet, in her way, she was as powerful as her siblings, for scandal can wound as deeply as armies, and allure can shape memory as surely as decrees. In Pauline's defiance, society glimpsed its own fragility. She laughed at rules, she embraced lovers without concealment, she reclined as Venus when she should have been veiled as a princess. Each act unsettled because it revealed how thin the fabric of propriety truly was. If one woman could live so openly, then what did that say of the rules that bound others? In this sense, she was both admired and feared, celebrated as a goddess, condemned as a danger. Her life became a mirror in which others saw their own desires and their own anxieties reflected. And yet beneath the scandal, there was also devotion. Her loyalty to Napoleon, unwavering even in exile, set her apart from many in her family. When power collapsed, when crowns were lost, she did not abandon him. She sold her jewels, she braved the winds of Elba, she spoke of him with pride even after Waterloo. In this, she became almost saintly, a figure of loyalty that contrasted with her reputation for sensuality. To call her half saint and half courtesan is not exaggeration but truth, for she lived in both realms, refusing to be confined to one alone. It is this refusal to be confined that gives her memory its enduring power. History often prefers clarity, prefers to classify figures neatly as virtuous or scandalous, loyal or selfish. Pauline resists such clarity. She was virtuous in loyalty, yet reckless in love, faithful as a sister, yet unfaithful as a wife, devout at the end, yet indulgent in life. She was all of these things, and none of them exclusively. Perhaps that is why she still fascinates. To speak of her is to confront the impossibility of simplicity in human life, the reality that contradiction is at the heart of existence. Imagine her name whispered in the courts of Europe after her death. To some, it was spoken with disdain. She, the shameless sister, the one who posed for Canova. To others, with admiration. She who followed Napoleon when no one else dared. Both were true. Both remain true. Her image divided, unsettled, provoked. And so her legend endured longer than many who lived more respectable lives, for respectability fades quickly, but contradiction lingers. In this way, Pauline became not only a figure of gossip, but also a symbol of her time. Napoleonic Europe was itself a contradiction. Half revolution, half empire, half freedom, half tyranny, half glory, half ruin. Pauline, in her life of beauty and scandal, embodied these contradictions in her own body. She was revolutionary in her defiance of convention, imperial in her grandeur, loyal in her devotion, and ruinous in her indulgence. To understand her is, in some small way, to understand the era itself. The echo of the unanswered question remains: was she redeemed or condemned? Perhaps the answer lies in how she chose to live. She never sought redemption in the eyes of society, never asked to be judged kindly. She lived instead for the moment, for the sensation, for the presence. And yet, at the end, she turned to faith, to prayer, to ritual. Perhaps this, too, was not contradiction, but completion. For if she lived as Venus, she died as a daughter of the Church, and in that balance lies her truth. The question fades into silence, leaving us only with an image, the polished marble of Canova's Venus, gleaming under the soft light of a gallery, Pauline's immortalized body forever reclined in victory, forever indifferent to judgment. And from that silence, from that marble stillness, comes the echo of another sound, the whisper of the sea returning to calm, as though inviting us to reflect not only on scandal and beauty, but on the way memory drifts, unresolved, into legend. The whisper of the sea returning to calm carries us now to the final meditation, where Pauline Bonaparte, both goddess and mortal, both scandal and devotion, slips fully into the tide of legend. The waves beat softly against unseen shores, their rhythm eternal, older than empires, older than beauty, older than scandal itself. In that rhythm her story dissolves, not into certainty but into mystery, not into judgment but into reflection. For to speak of Pauline is to speak of ambiguity, of a life lived in defiance of easy answers. She remains a figure both luminous and shadowed, her memory lingering like the shimmer of light upon water at dusk, neither fully present nor entirely gone. The sea, which framed her beginning in Corsica and her loyalty at Elba, frames also her ending in memory. Its sound is one of endless return, yet never the same wave twice, much like the stories told of her. Each retelling brings a new angle, a new emphasis. One recalls her as the scandalous Venus, another as the loyal sister, another as the frail woman seeking reconciliation in Rome. None of these alone suffice, and yet together they form a truth greater than any single tale. She is remembered not because she was consistent, but because she was not. She was changeable, contradictory, elusive, and therein lies her power. When we think of her lying back in Canova's marble, serene and victorious, we see more than a statue. We see a choice, a woman who dared to present herself not as princess or wife, but as goddess, indifferent to what society thought. When we think of her standing beside Napoleon in exile, we see more than loyalty. We see devotion that defied convenience, that endured when others abandoned him. When we think of her final days, listening to church bells and receiving holy water, we see not surrender but a gesture of reconciliation, as though she knew that life, like the sea, cannot be held in one state forever. The sea whispers, and with it comes the sense of drifting, of letting go. Pauline's life, filled with scandal and brilliance, becomes less sharp in memory, softened by time, blurred into legend. We are left not with verdicts, but with impressions. The scent of perfume in a midnight chamber, the clink of a half-filled wine glass, the cold touch of marble against warm skin, the murmur of voices behind closed doors, the toll of distant church bells. These fragments weave together not into certainty but into atmosphere, into the texture of a life lived vividly if not wisely. And perhaps that is the point. Wisdom was never Pauline's goal. She did not live to be remembered as prudent or virtuous. She lived to be present, to be admired, to seize each fleeting sensation. She was reckless, yes, but also brave in her refusal to hide, brave in her insistence on being fully herself in a world that sought to confine her. For that, history cannot forget her. For that, she remains timeless. The sea grows calmer still, its waves folding gently against the shore, its sound steady and soothing. In this sound we find the space to drift, to let our own thoughts wander as hers once did. Did she regret her choices? Did she, in her final moments, wish for a different life? We cannot know, and perhaps it does not matter. What matters is that she lived, vividly and completely, leaving behind not only scandal, but also a reminder that life, however brief, is to be felt as deeply as possible. So let the sea carry her now, as it carries all memories, smoothing edges, softening contrasts, until only the rhythm remains. Pauline Bonaparte, sister of an emperor, goddess of marble, scandal of Europe, lies forever in that rhythm, neither condemned nor redeemed, but remembered, her secrets dissolving like foam upon the tide. And as the waves settle, as the night deepens, we too may drift with them, letting the sound of history fade into the hush of sleep, where stories become dreams and dreams return to the sea.